The single father who once saved Halstead Dynamics from ruin was demoted to a janitor's cart for refusing to falsify a $120 million contract. 2 days later, the billionaire client behind that very deal walked straight past the new chief executive, crossed the marble lobby, and stopped beside the man holding a mop. "I sign nothing," he said, "unless he leads this negotiation." The woman who fired him had no idea her decision was about to expose a secret far more dangerous than one bruised ego, a secret that was already unraveling everything she had built. Halstead Dynamics was an industrial consulting firm preparing to sign the largest contract in its history, a logistics modernization project for Prescott Infrastructure Group worth $120 million. Grant Mercer had spent nearly 6 months shaping the strategy behind it, studying every plant, every shipping route, and every insurance clause, until he understood the deal better than the men who would eventually take credit for it. He was the one who realized Prescott did not need an ordinary vendor at all. What the company truly needed was a partner willing to accept responsibility when the project inevitably hit a crisis, because infrastructure work of that size never went perfectly, and everyone smart enough to admit it in advance was only one worth trusting with it. Grant was not the kind of man who commanded a room the moment he entered it. He dressed, simply spoke in short, exact sentences, and routinely let his team take the credit for work he had quietly carried on his own back. For years he had raised his daughter alone, after losing his wife, guiding her through school and heartbreak, and every ordinary crisis of growing up without once complaining about the weight of it. She was grown now, living in another state, her photograph the only trace of that life sitting on the corner of his desk. He had built an entire career on being the person who solved problems without needing anyone to notice, and that instinct had made him invaluable, and in the end, dangerously easy to underestimate. Brooke Halstead had recently inherited the chief executive position from her father, the company's founder, and she wanted the Prescott contract to prove once and for all that she was not simply living in his shadow. What she could not stand was the way Warren Prescott kept calling Grant directly to talk through strategy, as if the actual authority in the building belonged to a strategist 3 levels below her rather than to her. Every phone call Grant received from the client felt to her like a small public erosion of her own legitimacy, and she began to see him not as an asset, but as a rival she had never agreed to compete against. Nolan Pierce, the vice president of business development, fed that fear relentlessly. He told Brooke in private conversation after private conversation that Grant was quietly building influence of his own, and that if the Prescott deal succeeded under his direction, the board might eventually hand him authority equal to hers. Nolan had wanted Grant's position for years, and understood exactly which insecurities to press to get what he wanted, dressing his own ambition as loyalty to Brooke's leadership every single time he raised the subject. Just before the final approval meeting, Brooke asked Grant to adjust the revenue forecast, turning a conditional profit margin into a guaranteed one. The change would make the report look far more attractive on paper, but it would also expose Prescott to tens of millions of dollars in risk they had never agreed to carry. Grant refused outright, explaining that the numbers were not merely misleading but violated the transparency clause both companies had already agreed to in their preliminary terms. Brooke told him coldly that he seemed to have forgotten who actually ran the company, and Grant answered that he only remembered who would pay the price if they chose to lie. That single exchange was the moment Brooke decided he had to be removed from the deal entirely before the client ever arrived to see who was truly steering it. The next morning, Brooke called an emergency meeting and deliberately left Grant off the invitation list. He walked into the room anyway, only to find a gray maintenance uniform folded neatly on the chair that had been his for 11 years. The meeting the following morning was packed with senior executives, the legal department, and a representative from human resources, all summoned under the pretense of an urgent strategic review. Brooke stood at the head of the table and announced that Grant Mercer had displayed, in her words, serious insubordination and no longer fit the company's new leadership culture. She did not fire him outright, aware that his contract carried a substantial severance clause that would cost the company dearly, and instead invoked an internal reassignment provision to move him into facilities, operations, a department that had nothing to do with strategy, negotiation, or the deal he had spent half a year building. From nothing, Nolan announced almost before Brooke had finished speaking that he would personally take over leadership of the Prescott negotiation. Grant asked calmly whether the board had actually approved this decision. Brooke replied that a chief executive did not require permission to manage an employee she no longer considered reliable, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence that no one dared to break. Celeste Rowan, the chief financial officer, slid a document across the table, demanding Grant surrender every file related to the deal within the hour, and Grant understood immediately that Brooke wanted far more than his title. She wanted the entire strategy he had spent months constructing stripped from him and handed to a man who had never once questioned where the numbers came from. Human Resources requested his executive access card, his laptop, and the keys to his office in front of dozens of colleagues who had worked under his guidance for years. Brooke pointed toward the folded gray uniform and told him that starting immediately, his responsibilities would cover the hallways, the conference rooms, and the client lobby on the bottom 3 floors of the building. Several directors lowered their eyes in visible discomfort, but not one of them said a word in his defense. Audrey Bennett, a contract analyst who had once reported directly to Grant, wanted to object, but he gave her the smallest shake of his head, unwilling to let her put her own position at risk for a fight he had already decided not to have in that room. Grant removed the executive badge from his jacket without a trace of anger, set it on the table, and changed into the uniform in the employee locker room down the hall. Brooke had hoped the humiliation would provoke him into resigning on the spot. Instead, he signed the reassignment form without complaint and simply asked what time his new shift began, an act of composure that unsettled her far more than any outburst could have. Nolan followed him into the corridor and sneered that he should get comfortable with a mop instead of million-dollar meetings from now on. Grant only replied that Nolan might want to read addendum number 14 carefully before sitting down in the chair that used to be his, a warning Nolan dismissed as an empty threat from a man with nothing left to lose. While clearing his desk, Grant took only 3 things with him: a photograph of his late wife, an old handwritten notebook, and the pen Warren Prescott had given him years earlier after a difficult negotiation that had gone unexpectedly well. Brooke ordered his name stripped from every presentation slide in the building and banned him from the 38th floor, where the final negotiation with Prescott was scheduled to take place. As he walked out with the small box of his belongings, Grant noticed a folder discarded in Nolan's trash bin. The first page still carried his name, but every risk projection inside had already been replaced with the falsified figures Brooke had demanded weeks before. Grant's first shift began at 5:30 in the morning, well before the sun had fully risen over the city. He was assigned to prepare the main lobby before the Prescott delegation arrived later that day, and the same employees who had once reported directly to him now avoided his eyes or pretended not to recognize him at all. Grant said nothing about it. He worked with the same careful attention he had always brought to strategy meetings, fixing a jammed door along the way and helping the receptionist troubleshoot a faulty electrical panel that had been malfunctioning for weeks without anyone bothering to report it. While cleaning a lower-floor conference room, Grant overheard Nolan and Celeste speaking through a door left slightly ajar. They had quietly removed a clause meant to protect the client from fuel price volatility, and in exchange a consulting firm called Pierce Strategic Partners would collect nearly $3 million in advisory fees once the contract closed. Grant recognized the name immediately and suspected it belonged to Nolan himself, though he had no proof solid enough yet to act on. He chose not to accuse anyone in that moment, understanding that an accusation without evidence would only cost him whatever credibility he had left. Grant checked his handwritten notebook against the copy of the contract he had kept for himself and confirmed what he already suspected. Addendum number 14 required that any change to the risk model be certified by the person who originally designed it, and that person was Grant. Without his signature, Prescott retained the legal right to cancel the entire agreement, even after signing the initial memorandum, a safeguard he had built into the contract months earlier, precisely because he never fully trusted the leadership above him to keep their word under pressure. Meanwhile, Nolan rehearsed his presentation, using language lifted almost word for word from Grant's original analysis, without understanding the deeper logic supporting any of it. When Audrey asked him about a supply chain disruption scenario buried in the appendix, Nolan grew visibly irritated and told her sharply to stay quiet during the briefing. Brooke was beginning to feel the first tremors of doubt, but still believed the weight of her title alone would be enough to satisfy a client who had until recently trusted her company completely. Grant discovered a technical failure in the main conference room's projection system just hours before the delegation was set to arrive. The regular technicians were occupied elsewhere, so Grant repaired the system himself quietly, and without asking anyone's permission the same way, he had solved 100 smaller problems over the years that no one ever noticed until they were already fixed. Audrey found him privately near the storage room and told him that Nolan had ordered his name erased from the document revision history entirely, as though Grant had never touched the project at all. Grant warned her not to steal anything or break any policy on his behalf, asking only that she preserve whatever emails she had already legally received in the ordinary course of her work. It was a small distinction, but it revealed something essential about him. Even furious and humiliated, he refused to fight back by breaking the very principles that had gotten him removed in the first place. He also received a short message from Warren Prescott that read simply, "Tomorrow I expect to hear your final proposal from you directly." Grant looked at the message for a long moment, but did not respond since his access badge had already been deactivated, and Brooke had explicitly forbidden him from contacting the client under any circumstances. He understood that silence might allow the client to walk into a trap of falsified numbers, but reaching out on his own would hand Brooke every justification she needed to fire him outright for violating procedure. Grant chose a third path instead. He slipped a copy of Addendum number 14 into his cleaning cart and continued mopping the floor in front of the private elevator reserved exclusively for Warren Prescott's arrival the following morning. The next morning, Brooke assembled the entire executive team in the main lobby, dressed in a crisp white suit with internal cameras arranged and staff lined up in 2 neat rows to formally welcome the client. The Prescott delegation arrived shortly after, led by Warren himself, accompanied by legal counsel, an operations director, and 3 technical specialists, whose presence signaled just how seriously the client was treating the closing of the deal. Brooke stepped forward, first introducing herself as the architect of Halstead Dynamics' new strategic direction. Warren shook her hand politely, but almost immediately asked where Grant Mercer was. Brooke explained that the company had recently undergone an internal restructuring and that Nolan Pierce would now be leading the negotiation in Grant's place. Warren did not react right away. He simply glanced across the lobby and noticed a man in a gray uniform pushing a cleaning cart near the elevator bank, and for a moment, he genuinely thought his eyes were deceiving him. Warren left Brooke mid-sentence and walked directly toward Grant. The entire lobby fell silent as dozens of employees watched their newest client bypass the chief executive entirely. He asked Grant plainly why he was dressed as a maintenance worker. Grant did not criticize Brooke or offer any excuse. He simply said that his position had recently changed and that he was completing the assignment he had been given, an answer delivered with such steady composure that it somehow made the humiliation feel even more damning than an outburst would have. Warren turned back to Brooke and demanded a clear explanation. Brooke insisted that Grant no longer fit the direction of the company and attempted to paint him as someone who lacked a collaborative spirit. Warren rejected that characterization, immediately reminding her in front of the entire lobby that Grant was the only person at Halstead Dynamics who had ever warned him plainly that a project might fail, and that his honesty was the exact reason Prescott had chosen to trust the firm with a contract this large in the first place. Nolan tried to insert himself into the conversation, claiming he had already taken full ownership of the strategic model. Warren asked him 3 direct questions about insurance limits, transportation disruption, contingencies, and fuel price volatility. Nolan failed to answer a single one, completely stumbling through vague generalities that made it obvious to everyone in the room he had never truly understood the material he was reciting. Brooke suggested they move the conversation upstairs to avoid creating a spectacle in the open lobby. Warren refused to step into the elevator. Instead, he addressed the entire executive team standing before him. "We are not here to sign a contract with a job title," he said. "We are here to sign with the person who understands how to protect our investment." Then he turned to Grant directly and said the words that would upend the entire company by the end of the day, "I will not sign anything unless you lead this negotiation." Grant did not accept immediately. He explained that he currently held no authority to represent Halstead Dynamics and had no interest in overstepping the chief executive's authority, even after everything that had happened to him that week. His restraint only deepened Brooke's isolation, as Warren now demanded she restore Grant's authority on the spot. Brooke was left with an impossible choice in front of her most important client: reinstate the very man she had just humiliated, or watch a deal worth $120 million walk out the front door forever. Brooke agreed with visible reluctance to allow Grant to join the negotiation as a temporary advisor. Grant removed his work gloves, pulled the copy of Addendum number 14 from the cleaning cart, and said quietly, "Before we talk about any signature, there's a change you need to know about." The meeting shifted instantly from ceremony to interrogation. Grant was seated back at the table Nolan had claimed only days earlier, though he did not demand his title back or ask for any apology. He simply began working through the material with the same measured precision he had always used, as if the gray uniform he was still wearing were nothing more than an inconvenient detail. Grant laid two versions of the financial model side by side on the table. The first was the version he had built himself, which included a price adjustment mechanism and a reserve fund designed to protect both companies from unexpected shocks. The second was the version Nolan had prepared for signature, in which nearly all of the financial risk had been quietly shifted onto Prescott alone. Warren asked who had approved the change. Brooke claimed it had been a collective decision based on a recommendation from the finance department, and Celeste attempted to describe it as an effort to optimize profitability language that did nothing to explain why an outside firm stood to profit from it. Grant pointed out that a consulting firm was set to collect $3 million in advisory fees if the revised version were signed. Russell Vance, the company's lead attorney, immediately asked to see the registration details of that outside firm. Nolan insisted it was an independent partner with no connection to anyone in the room, a claim that fell apart within minutes. Audrey was brought in to pull up the document's revision history on the projector. The log showed clearly that Nolan had entered the outside firm's information only 2 days before Grant was demoted, a timeline no one in the room could reasonably call a coincidence. Grant explained that Addendum number 14 required the signature of the person who had originally designed the risk model before any changes could take legal effect, and without that signature, the revised terms meant nothing at all. Brooke accused Grant of using a technicality to sabotage the entire deal out of spite. Grant answered calmly that he was doing the opposite, preventing both companies from walking into a legal dispute that could drag on for years and cost far more than the contract itself was worth. Warren ordered the signing paused immediately, so his own legal team could review the documents in full, a decision that visibly rattled everyone at the table except Grant. Brooke pulled Grant into the hallway the moment the room cleared enough to speak privately. She offered to restore his title, raise his salary, and grant him a substantial bonus if he would simply walk back in, sign the addendum, and never mention the outside consulting firm again. Grant refused without hesitation. Brooke lost her composure and accused him of using the client to get revenge on her for the humiliation of the past 2 days. Grant told her plainly that revenge would have meant letting her sign the contract and watching the company collapse afterward. What he was doing instead was trying to stop exactly that from happening. Inside the conference room, Prescott's legal team discovered that Pierce Strategic Partners had been registered using the address of Nolan's own apartment. Worse, still preliminary banking records suggested Celeste held an indirect financial interest in the very same firm, a detail that shattered whatever fragile trust remained among the 3 executives who had built the scheme together. Nolan immediately tried to shift the blame onto Celeste. Celeste in turn insisted that Brooke had known about the advisory fee from the very beginning. Brooke denied it outright, but Grant could already see the entire leadership team beginning to turn on one another in real time. Warren announced that the contract would be frozen entirely pending an independent investigation, a decision that threatened to push Halstead Dynamics toward insolvency within 2 months, since the company had already borrowed heavily against the projected revenue from this single deal. Diane Whitmore, chairwoman of the board, appeared unexpectedly on a video call that had clearly been arranged the moment word of the freeze reached her office. "Brooke," she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, "this is no longer a sales meeting. This is an emergency hearing of the board of directors." Diane ordered every document in the building preserved immediately. No one was permitted to delete a single email, leave the premises, or contact anyone outside the company without going through legal counsel first. Brooke, cornered and desperate, shifted into pure defense. She claimed Grant had deliberately withheld critical information in order to sabotage the negotiation, describing his decision to bring the addendum in a cleaning cart as a calculated scheme to humiliate the chief executive in front of an important client. Nolan backed her story instantly, insisting that Grant had once threatened that no one could close the deal without him, a claim that conveniently ignored the mountain of evidence already sitting on the table. Grant refused to answer emotion with emotion. Instead, he asked the technology department to recover the audio recording from the meeting in which Brooke had originally ordered him to inflate the revenue forecast. Brooke insisted the system never recorded internal meetings of that kind. Audrey remembered almost as an afterthought that the conference room had an automatic transcription feature built in to assist remote participants. Nolan had deleted the file from the primary system, but a backup copy might still exist somewhere inside the compliance archive Russell Vance oversaw directly. Russell ordered the data locked down immediately before anyone else could touch it. While the recovery process ran, Brooke pivoted to attacking Grant's personal life instead of the facts in front of her. She described him as a single father who had spent years putting his family ahead of the company, refusing business trips, and never showing any real ambition to lead. Grant did not deny any of it. He said simply that raising his daughter alone had taught him that responsibility was never about standing at the top of an organization chart. It was about refusing to let someone else pay the price for a decision you made yourself. Warren told the room quietly that this was exactly why he trusted Grant in the first place. Brooke's support in the room began to collapse visibly with every passing minute. Celeste asked to speak privately with legal counsel, willing to offer evidence in exchange for leniency from the board. Nolan, realizing he might soon be betrayed by his own partners, quietly tried to slip out of the room, but security stopped him at the door, under Diane's explicit instructions. The recovered transcript finally appeared on screen. In it, Brooke was heard telling Grant to make the numbers pretty enough that the client can't say no, while Grant explicitly warned that the change could constitute a material misrepresentation under the terms of their agreement. Brooke tried weakly to argue she had only been using aggressive language to motivate performance, not issuing an order to commit fraud. Grant then produced an email he had sent to Brooke, Celeste, and Russell immediately after that meeting, clearly stating that he refused to approve the new model and requesting the original data be preserved untouched. Russell confirmed the email existed, though it had somehow been automatically redirected out of his priority inbox before he ever had the chance to read it. A technical trace revealed that Nolan's administrative privileges had been used to alter the forwarding rules on Russell's account without his knowledge or consent. Diane looked directly at Brooke and asked her a single question that seemed to hang in the air of the silent room. "Did you demote Grant because his performance was lacking?" she asked, "or because he was the only person here who refused to lie?" Brooke's silence stretched on for far too long, and in that silence everyone in the room understood exactly what her answer would have been if she had been willing to say it out loud. Warren asked to hear plainly, and without corporate polish, exactly why he had come to trust Grant in the first place. 6 years earlier, Prescott Infrastructure had faced a genuine crisis when one of its steel plants was forced to shut down without warning, threatening the survival of an entire division of the company. At the time, Grant had been nothing more than a mid-level analyst at Halstead Dynamics, far from any position of real authority. While other executives proposed layoffs and shifting the extra costs directly onto Prescott, Grant had quietly designed an alternative supplier network on his own time that ultimately saved the client more than $70 million. He never received a special bonus for the work, and the final report was signed under the name of a supervisor who had barely touched the project. Recognizing something in him that no title or promotion had ever fully captured, Grant's contributions extended far beyond Prescott alone. Nearly every major client Halstead Dynamics still retained had in some form been protected or rescued by a model Grant designed or personally revised over the years. Audrey presented internal data showing that close to 43% of the company's long-term revenue traced directly back to strategies he had authored, work Brooke had never seen in full because Nolan routinely presented it under the business development department's name instead of Grant's own. Diane revealed something even Brooke had never known. The company's founder had left behind a private note in the succession files years earlier, stating plainly that Grant possessed extraordinary leadership potential, but should not be promoted too quickly, since doing so would only make him a target for people who valued power more than competence. Brooke felt genuinely wounded hearing that her own father had rated Grant's judgment above her own. In certain respects, and in her wounded pride, she accused the board of having planned to replace her all along. Diane firmly rejected that accusation, insisting that no one had wanted to remove Brooke from her position until she herself put the entire company at risk. Celeste, hoping to soften her own exposure, laid out the mechanics of the $3 million advisory fee in full detail. According to her account, Nolan had proposed creating the outside firm from the start, and while Brooke never directly held shares in it, she had agreed to let a portion of the fee quietly fund a personal media campaign once the deal was publicly announced. Brooke insisted she had no idea where that funding had actually come from. Celeste produced a chain of emails proving otherwise, showing that Brooke had in fact been informed of the arrangement well before the negotiation ever began. Nolan, panicking now that his allies were turning on him one by one, tried to claim that both Brooke and Celeste had pressured him into the entire scheme against his will. Grant watched the collapse unfold without any visible satisfaction. Warren asked him directly whether he would consider leaving Halstead Dynamics entirely to work for Prescott, instead offering him strategic leadership authority and compensation many times greater than what he currently earned. Brooke realized with a sinking certainty that if Grant walked out the door, the contract would likely follow him and other clients might not be far behind. Grant did not answer right away. He said his first priority had to be protecting the thousands of ordinary employees who had nothing to do with the misconduct sitting at this table. Then he proposed an emergency restructuring plan that could still save the deal on one non-negotiable condition: Brooke had to step away from leading the negotiation, entirely effective immediately. Warren gave Halstead Dynamics exactly 4 hours to produce a revised proposal. If the deadline passed without one, Prescott would take the contract to a competing firm without further discussion. Diane suspended Brooke's authority on the spot and granted Grant temporary leadership of the negotiating team for the duration of the emergency. Grant removed his maintenance jacket, but did not bother changing into anything else. He walked into the strategy room still wearing the same gray uniform that had become in the span of a single day a symbol of everything the company had done wrong. He assembled a small, tightly focused team consisting of Audrey Russell, several operations engineers, and a financial analyst with no connection whatsoever to Celeste, deliberately cutting both Nolan and Celeste off from every system they might otherwise have used to interfere. The new proposal needed to solve 3 problems at once. It had to restore a genuine risk-sharing mechanism between both companies, eliminate the outside advisory fee completely, and offer some form of compensation to Prescott for the misleading terms the leadership team had originally tried to push through. Grant proposed reducing Halstead Dynamics' upfront profit margin, while adding a performance-based bonus structure that would reward the company if the project ultimately exceeded its targets. Several directors resisted the idea, worried the company could not afford reduced short-term cash flow, given how much it had already borrowed against this contract. Grant explained patiently that a smaller profit was still infinitely better than a canceled contract and a fraud lawsuit that could end the company altogether. He had also identified a significant cost-saving opportunity buried in the shipping network that Nolan had overlooked entirely, one substantial enough to offset nearly all of the reduced profit margin on its own. While the team worked, Brooke was kept isolated in a separate room with legal counsel watching through the glass as Grant led the very team that had once reported to her. Watching him work, she remembered the early years when he had quietly helped her prepare reports without ever once asking for credit, and she began slowly and painfully to understand that she had mistaken his loyalty for weakness all along. Even so, Brooke had not fully changed. She placed a private call to one board member, attempting to lobby against making Grant's leadership permanent, even as the negotiation continued around her. Russell discovered the call and reported it immediately to Diane, which meant Brooke had now openly violated the terms of her own suspension in front of the very people deciding her fate. Back in the negotiation room, Warren continued testing Grant with difficult, pointed questions, demanding real assurance that a scheme like this could never happen again inside the company. Grant proposed an independent audit mechanism, direct data access for the client at all times, and a clause allowing Prescott to suspend payment immediately if any unapproved change to the terms were ever discovered. These provisions placed significantly more accountability on Halstead Dynamics than before, but they also demonstrated a level of good faith that no amount of polished language could have replicated. With only 10 minutes remaining before the deadline, the team finished the revised proposal. Grant refused to sign it himself, insisting instead that Diane and Russell formally confirm his legal authority to represent the company before a single signature touched the page. Warren read through the final page, slowly closed the folder and looked up. "The terms have been fixed," he said. "But before I sign anything, I need to know who is actually going to run this company once the project begins." The board convened an emergency vote almost immediately after the negotiation concluded. The evidence against Nolan left little room for debate. He had personally established the outside consulting firm, manipulated financial data, and attempted to destroy the digital trail leading back to him. He was terminated on the spot. His case referred to outside authorities for a formal investigation into corporate fraud. Celeste was suspended pending review. Her cooperation with the investigation might eventually reduce her personal liability, but it would not be enough to save her position. Brooke's case proved far more complicated to resolve. She had not personally created the outside firm, but she had known the reports were falsified, approved a media campaign funded by questionable money, and demoted the one person who had tried to stop the entire scheme before it could spiral out of control. Diane asked Brooke to resign voluntarily. Brooke initially refused, arguing that a single mistake should not erase an entire career built over many years of hard work. The board then invited Grant to speak, and the room braced for him to demand her immediate removal without mercy. Grant said the issue was never that Brooke had made a mistake. Every leader made mistakes eventually. The issue was that she had used her authority to punish the one person who tried to stop that mistake before it became a disaster for everyone around her. He did not ask for forgiveness on her behalf, and he did not ask for punishment either. He simply asked the board to follow its own governance process and let the evidence speak for itself, without his personal feelings entering into the outcome at all. Brooke realized in that moment that even with every opportunity to destroy her out of pure emotion, Grant had refused to become the very kind of leader she had been. The board voted to remove her from the position of chief executive. She was permitted to leave without public humiliation, but she would be required to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation and would forfeit every bonus tied to the Prescott contract entirely. Before leaving the room for the last time, Brooke stopped in front of Grant. She admitted that she had demoted him because she was afraid the client and the board trusted him more than they trusted her. Grant told her that fear did not make her decision right, but admitting it out loud was at least the first real step toward taking responsibility for what she had done. The board then offered Grant the position of interim chief executive. Warren made clear that Prescott would only sign the final contract if Halstead Dynamics had a leader the client could genuinely trust going forward. Grant surprised everyone in the room by not accepting immediately. Instead, he laid out 3 conditions of his own. The company would establish an independent ethics committee. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be formally protected from retaliation, and credit for company achievements would finally go to the people who actually earned it. Diane agreed without hesitation. Grant accepted the role of interim chief executive for a term of 6 months, insisting that the long-term selection process for a permanent leader remained fully transparent to everyone inside the company. Warren signed the $120 million contract and then handed the pen across the table to Grant. It was remarkably the very same style of pen Grant had kept tucked inside his cleaning uniform for the past 2 days, a small, quiet detail that felt less like coincidence and more like the world finally correcting itself. 6 months later, the Prescott project was ahead of schedule and had already saved millions of dollars, thanks to the risk model Grant had originally designed and personally refined throughout the emergency negotiation. Halstead Dynamics had not merely avoided bankruptcy, it had rebuilt the trust of its clients, almost entirely one honest decision at a time. Grant was formally appointed chief executive after an independent evaluation process that the board conducted exactly as promised. He did not move into Brooke's old office right away. Instead, he transformed the 38th floor into an open working space, where operations, engineering, and finance staff could speak directly to one another, instead of being separated by rigid titles and closed doors. Audrey was promoted to Director of Risk Governance, a position she earned entirely through her own competence and the courage she had shown when it mattered most. Russell took charge of a new compliance program built specifically to prevent anything like the Prescott scandal from happening again. The company installed a tamper-resistant document archive and a direct reporting line that allowed any employee to flag misconduct straight to the board, without fear of the message quietly disappearing along the way. Grant ordered a full review of achievements across the previous 5 years. Employees who had once had their work quietly claimed by someone above them were finally recognized and properly compensated for what they had contributed. The facilities team received raises as well, and was invited for the first time to participate in the building's safety planning meetings alongside senior staff. Grant often explained that his time spent as a maintenance worker had shown him problems that executives at the top of the company never noticed at all. Broken doors left unfixed for months, employees pushed well past reasonable limits, the quiet, invisible people who kept the entire building running every single day without ever receiving thanks for it. Brooke never returned to the company. She sent Grant a private letter of apology, asking for nothing in return, not forgiveness, and not the restoration of her reputation. In it, she admitted that she had once believed power meant forcing other people into obedience. Grant had shown her without ever raising his voice that real power meant accepting responsibility, even when it would have been far easier to blame someone else instead. Grant kept the letter but never once used it for any public purpose. Nolan was formally prosecuted for fraud, falsifying company data, and concealing an undisclosed financial interest. Celeste reached a cooperation agreement with investigators, but was barred from holding any financial management position for a long time to come. Warren returned to Halstead Dynamics for the launch of the project's second phase. In Grant's office, he noticed the old gray maintenance uniform framed carefully on the wall and asked why Grant had chosen to keep it. Grant told him the uniform reminded him that a title could be taken away in a single meeting, but competence and principle belonged to no one but himself, and nothing anyone said in a boardroom could ever change that. In a speech to the entire staff, Grant did not describe what had happened as a personal victory. He told them plainly that the company had nearly lost $120 million, not because it lacked talented people, but because talented people had not been allowed to tell the truth without fear of losing everything for it. He announced a new company-wide policy: no employee could ever again be demoted or punished simply for refusing to sign off on data they believed to be false. After the speech, Grant received a call from his grown daughter, who told him she had watched the announcement and felt proud that he had not changed even now that he finally held real power in his hands. The call served as a quiet closing note to the story of the father who had raised her alone. She remained, as always, a presence felt rather than seen throughout everything that had happened. Grant stood alone in his office that evening, as the lights of the city began to rise outside the window. On his desk sat two objects side by side: his new executive badge and the old facilities identification card he had once been forced to wear. He placed them next to one another and let them sit there for a long moment, neither one erasing the other. The door opened quietly, and an older maintenance worker apologized, assuming the office was empty at this hour. Grant did not ask him to leave. He helped the man move a heavy desk out of the doorway, asked how his shift was going, and learned in passing that the air conditioning system on one of the lower floors still had not been fully repaired. Rather than calling an assistant to handle it, Grant simply went downstairs with him to look at it himself. In the final image of that evening, the new chief executive stepped into the elevator dressed in a tailored suit, a small toolbox still resting in his hand. On the wall behind his desk hung the gray uniform beside a small handwritten line that read, "Simply never confuse a person's assignment with their worth." A title can create power for a while, but honesty is what builds trust that actually lasts. Brooke did not lose the chief executive's chair because Grant was stronger than she was. She lost it because she used her power to hide the truth instead of protecting it. And Grant did not reclaim his place through revenge. He reclaimed it by standing up quietly and without exception for every person who had once stayed silent while he was humiliated for refusing to lie.